Greetings, dear subscribers and casual listeners of my channel. Today we're diving into one of the most intriguing topics in the Harry Potter universe, the secret powers of Lord Voldemort. We all know the Dark Lord as the embodiment of evil, but is that truly the full extent of his strength? The films showed only the tip of the iceberg. The books revealed a little more, yet even they failed to capture the true depth of his magical talents. This is where Pottermore comes in, treasure trove of rare facts and hidden details about the wizarding world. Today, we'll uncover what he who must not be named was really capable of. Enjoy the video. Number 1. The ability to perform magic without a wand. Many believe a wand is a wizard's essential tool. Even Dumbledore and McGonagall relied on theirs. But Voldemort was the exception. He mastered both wandless and non-verbal magic. In complete silence, he could cast unforgivable curses, spells most wouldn't dare to utter even aloud. During the battle at the Ministry of Magic, he summoned the ground itself, without a wand and without words. It was a stunning display of high-level magic that even left Dumbledore impressed. Number 2. Master of Fire Spells. When Voldemort was enraged, fire became his weapon of choice. During his duel with Dumbledore, he conjured a giant serpent from Fiendfire, again silently, without a wand. This wasn't just his spell, and it was a catastrophe under his control. Fire in Voldemort's hands was a symbol of destruction and fear. Many believe his reliance on blazing attacks reflected a deep inner instability. A wizard who commands hellfire is not someone you'd want to meet in the dark. Number 3. The ability to fly without spells. Voldemort broke not only moral laws but also the laws of magical physics. He could fly and without a broom, spell, or artifact. We first see this when he escapes battle or swiftly chases his target. The only one known to replicate this was Severus Snape, and even he, according to rumor, simply copied the Dark Lord's technique. This was a unique achievement that proved Voldemort lived by his own magical rules. Number 4. Creator of original spells. Voldemort didn't just study magic in depth, he reinvented it. One of his creations was the Mors Morda spell, which summoned the dark mark in the sky. This wasn't just a dramatic effect, it was psychological warfare that paralyzed the wizarding world with fear. Creating new spells requires tremendous intellect and control over magical energy, and in this Voldemort was unmatched. Number 5. A magical genius. From childhood, Tom Riddle displayed extraordinary intellectual gifts. He mastered complex subjects with ease, read ancient texts, formulated his own theories, and practiced advanced spells long before his peers. His talent was so exceptional that even the professors at Hogwarts, including Dumbledore, feared him. He was the best student the school had ever seen, perhaps rivaled only by Albus himself. His genius laid the foundation for everything he would later become. Number 6. Master of Curses. Not only the unforgivable curses bowed to the Dark Lord's will, he commanded the entire spectrum of curses, destructive, protective, explosive, piercing. His magic could dissolve barriers, shatter shields, and bend the will of his victims. The most famous example, the curse on the Defense Against the Dark Arts position at Hogwarts, which he cast after being denied the job. Since then, no one held the position for more than a year. Even his name was cursed. Anyone who spoke it would instantly reveal their location. Number 7. Duel Master. A duel with Voldemort meant almost certain defeat. He was unbelievably fast, unconventional, and unpredictable. Even seasoned auras like Mad-Eye Moody couldn't stand against him. His fighting style was both elegant and devastating. He could adapt on the fly, confuse his opponent, and strike from unexpected angles. Harry Potter only defeated him thanks to a stroke of luck. In a fair duel, survival would have been nearly impossible. Number 8. Occlumency and legilimency. Voldemort could see through lies like glass. He didn't need Veritasirum, he used legilimency, a silent intrusion into the mind sharper than any blade. In Half-Blood Prince, Snape warns Harry, the Dark Lord can read minds. He wasn't exaggerating. Voldemort sensed betrayal before it happened. When a Death Eater faltered, Voldemort didn't question. He knew. His eyes would narrow and the traitor's fate was sealed. Even when Bellatrix, his most devoted follower, feared he'd found doubt in her mind, she trembled. "I have never wavered, my lord." But his greatest strength was what he could hide. Occlumency wasn't just defense, it was silence, a wall, a void. Dumbledore himself admitted he couldn't fully read Tom Riddle. His powers of concealment are legendary, he told Harry. Even then, Voldemort locked away not just thoughts, but parts of his soul. He trained his mind like a fortress. That's why the prophecy eluded him. Why Harry's connection caused pain. He couldn't fully close the door, but he could keep the lights off. In a world of wands and curses, Voldemort's most dangerous weapon was thought kept secret. Number 9, control over magical creatures. Nagini was more than a pet. She was Voldemort's second set of eyes. In Deathly Hallows, readers learn their connection went beyond speech. He could feel her excitement, her hunger, the narration says, as she hunted with him. Their bond was magical, deep, almost symbiotic. When she struck, it was with his will. When he slept, she guarded him like a shadow. No leash, no cage, just complete, terrifying loyalty. She was also a Horcrux, holding a piece of his soul, which made their link even more unnatural. Through her, Voldemort became something more than human, and less than it too. His power didn't end with Nagini. He summoned giants from the mountains, creatures too wild for the Ministry to handle. Hagrid's brother Grawp was a rare exception, but most giants followed brute strength, and Voldemort offered that in abundance. Dementors also flocked to his side. Creatures of despair, they responded to his darkness like moths to flame. "The Dementors have deserted Azkaban," Fudge said grimly in Order of the Phoenix. They weren't controlled by spells. They were drawn by the aura of death and cruelty he carried like a storm. Even the dead obeyed him. In theory, corpse puppets risen from lakes and graves guarded his Horcruxes. When Harry and Dumbledore crossed the Black Lake in Half-Blood Prince, dozens of rotting arms pulled at their boat. Voldemort had commanded the uncommandable. He didn't just rule people, he ruled monsters, he spoke their language, he moved like one of them. And in the shadows they moved with him. Number 10, alchemy and potion making. In his Hogwarts years, Tom Riddle was more than a brilliant student, he was a silent alchemist. Slughorn praised his potion-making skills, even before understanding who the boy would become. Tom never just followed instructions, he experimented, tweaked, improved. And decades later, that knowledge gave him what no other wizard achieved, rebirth. In Goblet of Fire, Voldemort returns with flesh and bone, pulled from a cauldron through a ritual potion that defied magic itself. Bone of the Father, unknowingly given in blood of the enemy, flesh of the servant. It wasn't just evil, it was genius. That potion wasn't listed in any textbook. It required deep knowledge of life, sacrifice, and blood magic, branches of alchemy most wizards feared to touch. Wormtail couldn't have created it alone. Even Snape, who brewed Wolfsbane and Veritaserum with ease, might have struggled. Voldemort crafted a process that used ancient symbols, real human components, and exact timing. It restructured his form, remade his spirit, and rejected death. "Lord Voldemort has risen again," he whispered, rising from the cauldron. And the dark mark burned. He didn't stop at resurrection. In Philosopher's Stone, he sustained himself using unicorn blood and a potion stolen from Snape's stores. Later, he created elixirs to preserve his body, to poison objects, to manipulate emotions. His magic wasn't just about spells, it was chemistry, transmutation, control. He understood that immortality wasn't one spell, it was a recipe, and he was its only true master. Number 11, possession and soul transfer. Voldemort refused to die. When his killing curse rebounded in Godric's Hollow, his body was destroyed, but not his soul. What remained was a wisp, a shadow, less than the meanest ghost, as he later described. But even in that pitiful form he endured. In Philosopher's Stone, he clung to Professor Quirrell, hiding behind his turban, whispering into his thoughts, feeding off his life. "He is with me wherever I go," Quirrell confessed, trembling. "I met him when I travelled the world. I was a fool." This was more than possession. Voldemort didn't just ride inside someone's mind, he consumed it. Quirrell, once a nervous but kind scholar, became cold, cruel, and murderous. He killed unicorns for Voldemort's survival. He tried to steal the Philosopher's Stone. He let himself be burned alive rather than resist. That wasn't loyalty, it was domination. Voldemort hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a shell. No ordinary wizard could do this. Possession requires brutal force of will. It shatters weaker minds. Even ghosts can't interfere with the living like that. But Voldemort's soul, already torn by Horcruxes, moved freely between life and death. In Goblet of Fire, he speaks of his time in Albania, where he took over animals, even snakes, to stay alive. "I was little more than spirit, less than the meanest ghost, but I was alive." He endured years in agony, surviving in bodies that barely held him. This power made him immortal in a way no spell could. He could never be truly hunted because he could always hide, in flesh, in shadow, in fear. Even after death he lingered. When Harry saw him at King's Cross, a childlike, flayed form whimpered under a bench. That was what was left of his soul. But before that, for years, he had worn other people's skin. Voldemort didn't just break the laws of magic, he broke the boundaries of identity itself. Number 12, power of persuasion and manipulation. Before he became the Dark Lord, Tom Riddle was a boy who could charm a room without lifting his wand. He didn't need magic to control people. He used words, smiles, flattery, fear. Professor Slughorn was one of the first to fall under his spell. "You are, I believe, a very gifted young man," Slughorn told him. Riddle smiled, soft and polite. Then he asked the question that changed everything. What would happen if one made more than one Horcrux? Slughorn hesitated, but he answered, because Tom knew exactly how to pull the truth out of him. Voldemort's power to manipulate didn't end with schoolmasters. He convinced entire families to join his cause. Lucius Malfoy, a pure-blood aristocrat, believed he served a greater vision. Bellatrix Lestrange worshipped him like a god. Peter Pettigrew gave up his oldest friends to follow him. None of them were cursed or bewitched. They listened. They believed. They gave him their loyalty freely. That was Voldemort's true magic. He offered people exactly what they wanted to hear, and they mistook it for truth. Even when he returned in Goblet of Fire, he didn't threaten his Death Eaters first. He welcomed them. "I forgive you," he told them, voice like silk. "One more death, and our path will be clear." His promises were cold, calculated illusions, but they worked. He built an army on guilt, pride, and fear. He made men like Barty Crouch Jr. and Antonin Dolohov believe they were chosen. He made them crave purpose. Then he used them like weapons. Dumbledore once said, "Voldemort's gift for spreading discord and enmity is very great." It wasn't just because he was feared. It was because he understood people, their weaknesses, their hopes, their shame. He didn't cast spells to control minds. He whispered just loud enough to make them doubt themselves. Then he filled that silence with devotion. That's what made him unstoppable, and that's what made him so dangerous. Number 13, self-transfiguration and alteration of appearance. Voldemort did not simply look like a monster. He made himself one. The transformation of his face into something snake-like wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of dark magic and willful self-transfiguration. He removed his humanity piece by piece, just as he divided his soul. Harry described him as white as a skull with wide, livid scarlet eyes and a nose that was as flat as a snake's. Or that wasn't illness, it was choice. A face built to terrify, a body designed to mock life itself. He used his own flesh as a canvas for fear. The more his power grew, the more he abandoned the shape of the man he once was. No beard, no eyebrows, no colour in his skin, no softness in his voice. When he returned to life in the graveyard, Harry noticed that his new form was slick, inhuman, and cold. "I can touch you now," he whispered to the boy, smiling with thin lips that didn't seem made for kindness. His voice alone could paralyze a crowd. But even before that, Tom Riddle was a master of disguise. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore tells Harry about the time Riddle visited Hepzibah Smith. He was charming, elegant, perfectly dressed. He used looks to manipulate. He knew when to be handsome and when to become horrifying. The young man had manners, Hepzibah remembered, glowing. But 2 days later she was dead, and her treasure, Hufflepuff's cup, was gone. That was Voldemort's beauty, a mask for murder. He also used magic to become untraceable. Polyjuice potion, illusions, glamours. He slipped into minds and appearances like a serpent into shadow. In Albania, he took over bodies, living like a phantom, hiding in the skin of others. By the time he returned, his true face was no longer human, and no one could guess what he once looked like. He erased Tom Riddle completely. Voldemort became his only identity. Not born of nature, but sculpted by obsession and cruelty. Number 14, Horcrux creation and soul-splitting. Horcruxes were Voldemort's most terrifying invention. Even Dumbledore, with all his wisdom, admitted Lord Voldemort has seemed to grow less human with the passing years. That wasn't a metaphor. Tom Riddle tore his soul apart, again and again, until only fragments remained. Most dark wizards wouldn't dare to make even one Horcrux. It requires murder, and worse, a violent act against the natural order. But Voldemort made 7. He shattered himself deliberately, believing it was the only path to immortality. Each Horcrux held a part of him, hidden inside a powerful object. The diary of Tom Riddle, charming, clever, and cursed, was the first we ever saw. When Ginny Weasley opened it, she didn't just hear his voice. He possessed her, drained her, used her to reopen the Chamber of Secrets. That wasn't just a memory, that was Voldemort himself, a part of his soul, living inside ink and paper. Dumbledore said very few wizards would be capable of making even one. Voldemort treated soul-splitting like a craft. But he didn't stop there. He chose items that connected him to Hogwarts founders. Hufflepuff's cup, Slytherin's locket, Ravenclaw's diadem. Each object wasn't just a hiding place, it was a statement, a message. I am above death. I am eternal. These weren't trophies, they were anchors. The destruction of each one wasn't just a step in Harry's mission, it was Voldemort's slow unraveling. And the cost? By the end, he didn't understand love, or grief, or even fear. When he killed Harry in the forest, he thought he'd won. But a part of his own soul died instead. Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living, and above all, those who live without love. That was the price of his ambition. Voldemort tried to outwit death. He only made himself more fragile, less human, and in the end... Utterly alone. Number 15. Magical Artifact Resonance. In the shadows of Voldemort's rise, hidden beneath the surface of wars and whispered curses, lay a truth the wizarding world never fully saw. Not all of Tom Riddle's power came from raw skill or forbidden spells. What truly set him apart was a silent, terrifying gift, the ability to bond with magical artifacts in a way no other wizard ever had. These were not mere tools to him. They were extensions of his soul, and more disturbingly, his will. When he touched an artifact, it changed. When he poured magic into it, the object didn't simply obey, it resonated. It bent, absorbed, and reshaped itself around him. This was more than Horcrux making, it was transmutation of matter and meaning. The medallion of Salazar Slytherin was a family heirloom long before Tom Riddle laid eyes on it. To most, it was a beautiful relic of a bygone era, valuable for its age and magical heritage, but under Voldemort's influence, it grew malignant. After being transformed into a Horcrux, it didn't simply store a fragment of his soul. It began to project his very nature. Anyone who wore it, as Harry, Ron, and Hermione later discovered, began to feel the sting of his presence. The locket was burning cold against his chest, a heavy weight dragging him down. Deathly Hallows, Chapter 19. The artifact became a living echo of his psyche, whispering fear, feeding doubt and corrupting resolve. It was no longer just an object. It was Voldemort, watching from inside the chain. The diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, once a beacon of wisdom, suffered a similar fate. Centuries after it had been lost, Voldemort found it buried in the Room of Requirement and without hesitation filled it with his essence. But something happened beyond simple soul-splitting. The diadem began to emanate a subtle madness, as if wisdom, twisted through the prism of Voldemort's ambition, became poisonous. When Harry approached the diadem during the Battle of Hogwarts, he sensed something was deeply wrong. The room pulsed with a coldness not entirely physical. Later, when the diadem was destroyed by fiend fire, it screamed, not in metal, but in something else, something alive. Then there was Helga Hufflepuff's cup, once a symbol of nourishment and loyalty. Voldemort desecrated it without hesitation. The cup, designed to carry magic that comforted and sustained, began to bite. Hidden in the Lestrange vault, it radiated a protective malice that only grew stronger over time. When Hermione and Ron finally managed to destroy it, the room filled with the sound of a terrible cry. A shriek of fury, of pain, of horror. Deathly Hallows, Chapter 31. Not merely a safeguard spell, but the cry of something that had been living, conscious, and violated. These transformations went beyond the known mechanics of Horcruxes. Wizards and scholars throughout history had hidden parts of their souls in objects, but none had ever reported their artifacts becoming active agents of psychological warfare. Voldemort didn't just hide in these objects. He rewrote them. He imbued them with emotions, thoughts, fragments of memory, and cruel instincts. A Horcrux is meant to preserve life. Voldemort's creations interfered with life, distorted perception, and poisoned emotion. Even the Cursed Diary, perhaps the most well-known Horcrux, displayed this eerie sentience. When Ginny Weasley first began writing in it, she thought she had found a sympathetic friend, but what Voldemort had created wasn't a mere recording or magical echo. It was Tom Riddle himself, reborn. The diary didn't just speak, it seduced, it drained, it grew. "I've always been able to charm the people I needed," it wrote to her, and through the ink a piece of him began to awaken, ready to reclaim physical form. No other Horcrux in magical history is known to have achieved such complexity. The power to manipulate magical artifacts wasn't always overt. Voldemort's influence stretched into subtler realms. Even objects that weren't Horcruxes felt his weight. Consider the gaunt ring set with the resurrection stone. Though Dumbledore suspected the curse upon it came from standard dark enchantments, the speed and viciousness with which it attacked his hand suggests otherwise. The ring had become predatory, waiting for touch like a coiled beast, as if it knew it held something precious and forbidden. It didn't just hold a trap. It was the trap. Voldemort had trained it to be so. But nowhere was his struggle more vivid than with the Elder Wand. That wand, forged by Death himself according to legend, was known for choosing only the most powerful of masters. But when Voldemort claimed it, something faltered. Unlike other wands which bent easily to his strength, the Elder Wand resisted. It was the rare moment where artifact and wielder clashed, Voldemort believed power was enough. He thought possessing the wand would make it his. Yet the wand, like a sentient creature, refused him. It answered only to loyalty and conquest, and it knew its true master. This moment reveals the limit of Voldemort's ability. He could overwhelm, corrupt, and reshape almost anything, but he could not forge true loyalty, and the Elder Wand recognized that fault. When he cast the killing curse on Harry with the wand, the spell rebounded. The wand exploded in his hand, and Voldemort fell backward, arms splayed. Deathly Hallows, Chapter 36. The wand had made its choice, and Voldemort's dominance was shattered. It was the only object he could not truly bind to his essence. The relationship between Voldemort and his artifact is a story of mutual infection. He changed them, but they also began to reflect deeper truths about him. The medallion revealed his paranoia, the cup, his hunger for control, the diadem, his intellectual arrogance, the diary, his need for adoration, the ring, his obsession with legacy. Each object became a mirror, and in each mirror a different demon looked back. These weren't just symbols of dark magic. They were reflections of a shattered soul, attempting to become immortal by splitting itself into readable, touchable pieces. Number 16. Suppressing other wizards' magic. In the final battle at Hogwarts, when Lord Voldemort descended into the heart of the Great Hall, the air itself recoiled. Spells that had soared only moments ago now faltered, the energy around them cracking like brittle glass. Wands trembled in hands that had, mere seconds earlier, wielded them with certainty. It wasn't simply fear, though fear, cold and ancient, oozed from every corner when he arrived. It was something far more primal. Magic itself responded to his presence not as a rival, but as prey. In this moment, and many others across the series, the true scale of Voldemort's power flickered at the edges of the narrative like a shadow, too large to be named directly. What the films never showed, and what the books only hinted at, was perhaps Voldemort's most terrifying talent, his ability to suppress the magic of others, to bend the very rules of magical physics by mere proximity. At the climax of the Goblet of Fire, when Harry finds himself trapped in the graveyard and Voldemort has just returned, there is an eerie stillness that settles before any curse is cast. When Voldemort taunts Harry to duel, it is not merely the fear of facing a murderer that fills the space, it is the way magic hangs, waiting as though reluctant to move without Voldemort's will. When the wands connect, and priori incantatem occurs, Harry's magic doesn't function as expected. The spell rebounds, yes, but it's unstable, twisted by the energy around it. And then a narrow beam of light connected the two wands, and Harry felt his wand vibrating as though an electric charge was surging through it. Magic was fighting to exist in that moment, forced into shapes that didn't belong to it. That wasn't just wand compatibility, it was magical pressure, an invisible field in which Voldemort stood as the axis of all function. Dumbledore, one of the only wizards who could stand toe-to-toe with Voldemort, seemed to understand this power deeply. In the battle at the Ministry of Magic, when Dumbledore arrives to protect Harry, his magic is crisp, deliberate, and sharp. But even he does not overwhelm Voldemort. Rather, they exist in a balance that is tense and strained, like two natural disasters meeting at the border of destruction, as described in Order of the Phoenix. For a few seconds they circled each other like prowling beasts, and then Voldemort raised his wand and sent out a jet of green light. But before this moment, the hall had already begun to react to his presence. The protective enchantments placed in the Department of Mysteries seemed to buckle. The time room's glass shattered, spells warped into unintended consequences. The chaos didn't begin with the duel, it began when Voldemort entered the space. In Deathly Hallows, there is another whisper of this phenomenon during the final siege. When Voldemort sets up camp in the Forbidden Forest and then moves toward the castle after Harry's supposed death, the magic around Hogwarts begins to unspool. Protective enchantments that were ancient and complex laid down by generations of headmasters, sealed with the blood and trust of the school's founders, begin to fade, not because they were broken, but because they retreated. The forest grew still. The centaurs, creatures deeply attuned to magic, refused to move until after Voldemort's departure. It was as if the magical world, sentient and cautious, recoiled from his existence. He was not merely a powerful wizard. He was the magical equivalent of a black hole, pulling the very essence of the world inward, eroding boundaries that others dared not touch. In the moments when he appears unexpectedly, such as during the attack on the burrow in Half-Blood Prince, or his assault on the Ministry's records in Deathly Hallows, there is an absence more terrifying than any visible destruction. Rooms fall silent, wards vanish without a struggle. His very name was enchanted to trigger detection spells, but even those failed to pinpoint his presence reliably. When Hermione, Ron, and Harry break into the Ministry under Polyjuice Potion, Yaxley boasts of Voldemort's new position within the government, but no one dares speak of what it feels like when he walks into a room. It's not just political fear, it's magical displacement. A sort of silence that warps the air, causing magic to stutter like breath held too long. This power isn't dramatized with flashy incantations or cinematic displays, and perhaps that's why it was never captured in the films. But the books leave breadcrumbs for the attentive. When Ollivander speaks of wand lore and the intricacies of magical allegiance, he says, "The wand chooses the wizard. That much has always been clear to those of us who have studied wand lore." Yet Voldemort bent wands to his will regardless of their loyalties. His wand, stolen or won, functioned without rebellion. The Elder Wand, whose loyalty belonged to Harry, still allowed Voldemort to channel deadly magic. This wasn't a fluke, it was suppression. Voldemort's magic didn't negotiate, it dominated. Even wands, deeply attuned magical artifacts with personalities of their own, seemed hesitant to resist him fully. There is a moment in the Half-Blood Prince, as Snape flees with Draco, when the Death Eaters confront a small group of defenders. Spells fly, but not with their usual grace. When Voldemort's presence looms in the background, implied, hinted at in the panic that overtakes the castle, students and teachers alike are less effective. Spells that would otherwise hold crack under pressure. Magic requires belief, intention, focus. But when your very thoughts are being compressed by an invisible force, by a magical presence that blots out confidence like a storm blots out the stars, how can one cast even a simple charm with clarity? Number 17. Study of ancient magic. In the shadowed corners of the magical world, beyond the polished corridors of Hogwarts and the dusty shelves of Flourish and Blots, there existed a knowledge far older than the wizarding world dared to admit. While students memorized wand movements for charms and practiced levitation in well-lit classrooms, one boy, brilliant and dangerous, sought power buried in ash and silence. Tom Marvolo Riddle did not simply study magic, he excavated it. The films glossed over this disturbing truth, and even the books whispered it only between the lines. Voldemort wasn't just a practitioner of dark magic, he was a scholar of the forbidden, an archaeologist of magical antiquity, and a seeker of forgotten arts that had survived only in curses, blood rites, and half-burned scrolls. Long before he carved his soul into fragments, Riddle was already diving into the remnants of ancient civilizations. The restricted section of the Hogwarts library, which filled others with unease, was merely a threshold for him. He pushed further into the esoteric and arcane. Dumbledore once told Harry he disappeared for 10 years. He travelled far and wide, sank so deeply into the dark arts that he emerged barely human. What he learned in those years was never fully catalogued, but traces remain like charred edges of a page that refused to burn entirely. Voldemort's mastery of Horcruxes was not the result of simple ambition. It was the outcome of meticulous research into rituals that dated back to Babylonian necromancers and Egyptian priest-kings who communed with the afterlife. Buried in Chapter 23 of Half-Blood Prince, Slughorn's reluctant memory reveals the term Horcrux with dread. He admits, "It's a terrible thing, Tom. You split your soul, you see, and hide part of it in an object." But what Slughorn fails to mention, and what the Ministry refuses to document, is that the Horcrux was not a 20th century innovation. In ancient Sumer, carved obsidian idols were found in crypts with signs of soul-binding magic, inscriptions worn but decipherable, zinum ti, life trapped. In Egypt, a pharaoh whose name was erased from all monuments was believed to have hidden his essence in a golden amulet, entombed under the Nile. Voldemort was the first modern wizard to recreate the ritual successfully, but he was not the first to try. When Voldemort hunted knowledge, he didn't just read, he dismembered history. At Borgin and Burke's, where he worked after school, he made himself very proficient at charming objects out of old witches and wizards, as Dumbledore noted. But he also looted memories and relics. In Knockturn Alley, there were whispers of a long-lost tome bound in basilisk hide, said to contain spells used by a forgotten Mesopotamian cult. Some believe Voldemort found it, others say he recreated it from fragments smuggled out of a ruined temple near Ur. The dark mark, with its twisting serpent and skull, may have roots in these early death-worshipping sects. Voldemort never created symbols randomly. His choices were deliberate, often echoing ancient blasphemies. The creation of the Horcruxes was merely the surface of his ambitions. He longed to undo death, not just for himself, but in defiance of nature. In Deathly Hallows, Dumbledore reflects on Tom's motivations. He feared death above all else. But what terrified Voldemort wasn't dying, it was being forgotten. The soul fragmentation was a step toward immortality, but he sought a deeper kind of permanence, one hidden in myth. There is a passage in Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them that references the Uzkra, a now extinct Eastern European magical species said to guard the gates of the beyond. In a rare footnote by Newt Scamander's grandfather, there's mention of a ritual performed by the pale man with slit eyes, who tried to summon the creature in a blood circle in the Carpathians. The description matches Voldemort during his exile. What was he summoning if not a guardian of death's final boundary? Even within Hogwarts, young Riddle's fascination with the lost and the ancient bloomed early. The Chamber of Secrets wasn't just a hidden room, it was a crypt of pre-Christian magical thought. Salazar Slytherin was steeped in medieval blood rites and Parseltongue, a language so old it predates Latin. When Riddle unlocked the chamber, he wasn't merely proving his lineage, he was communing with a lineage of magic that was primal, untamed. The basilisk itself, a creature born of ritualistic breeding, was tied to Greco-Egyptian myths, where serpents guarded the underworld's gates. By controlling it, Voldemort wasn't just a descendant of Slytherin, he was his intellectual heir. In Albania, Voldemort didn't just hide, he conducted experiments. One witch, later imprisoned in Nurmengard, confessed to seeing a man with no face reading by torchlight from a scroll made of skin. Whether literal or symbolic, the story fits the pattern. Voldemort practiced spells lost to time, rituals that required sacrifice and silence. His body was misshapen not simply by evil, but by centuries-old incantations never meant for mortals. His resurrection in Goblet of Fire is often remembered for its ingredients: bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy, but its structure mirrored early Celtic rites where ancestors were invoked through bone magic, and the living offered tribute to the dead. What makes Voldemort terrifying isn't just his cruelty, it's his erudition. He understood that true power lay not in brute force but in forgotten knowledge. In Order of the Phoenix, Hermione mentions the Department of Mysteries and the Hall of Prophecy. But few notice that one door, locked permanently, leads to the Hall of Love, a chamber studied but never understood. Some believe Voldemort once broke into that room, that his experiments in soul magic were not about severance but control, an attempt to isolate love as a magical force and strip it from his being entirely. The result was catastrophic. He could not love, he could not trust. But he did not consider it a loss, he considered it evolution. Among the ruins of Nurmengard, after Grindelwald's death, there were reports of missing tomes from the library of the Dark Tower. These were not about dueling or hexes, they were philosophical. Treatises on the architecture of magic, theories about the soul's weight and velocity after death. It's rumoured that Voldemort had agents who retrieved these works and that he kept them in a vault beneath Malfoy Manor. One scroll, De Anima Occulta, was attributed to an unnamed Roman wizard who believed time could be reversed by splitting the spirit into equal parts. It is eerily similar to Voldemort's 7 Horcrux strategy. Coincidence or continuity? In Chamber of Secrets, when Riddle's memory speaks to Harry, he says, "I knew I had to find out everything I could about the chamber. All told me the same thing, that it hadn't been opened for 50 years. But what he doesn't say is how he pieced together the information. The answer may lie in the hidden archives of the Hogwarts founders, rooms supposedly sealed with blood and accessible only through ancestral magic. Voldemort's ability to bypass those protections hints that he'd uncovered secrets even Dumbledore hadn't, not through brute force, but through precision, patience, and a willingness to embrace heresy. Number 18, magical intuition and foreshadowing. Lord Voldemort's powers extended far beyond what the films showed, and even beyond what many readers of the books fully grasped. Hidden between the lines of J.K., Rowling's narrative is a chilling, subtle truth. Voldemort possessed a form of magical intuition so sharp, so refined, that it bordered on prophecy. He was not a seer in the traditional sense. He scoffed at Trelawney's vague mutterings and dismissed the Department of Mystery's prophecy hall as a collection of irrelevant oracles. And yet time and again Voldemort behaved like someone who felt the invisible threads of destiny tightening around him. His instincts were precise, lethal, and eerily accurate. They guided his rise, protected him from betrayal, and even whispered to him truths he refused to consciously accept. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Voldemort recruits Draco Malfoy for a suicide mission, an act that seemed on the surface like cruelty wrapped in desperation. But Voldemort had already begun to suspect Severus Snape. He never trusted anyone fully, but in Snape's case, the distrust grew like a shadow, quiet but impossible to ignore. Despite Snape's flawless service record, his occlumency, and the fact that Voldemort himself had trained in the darkest arts of mind control and detection, something gnawed at him. He could not see Snape's betrayal, but he felt it, sensed it in the way a predator senses an ambush moments before it happens. "You are a clever man, Severus," Voldemort once said coldly, "but there are those I do not trust to the end." It wasn't logic, it was instinct. This instinct reached beyond personal relationships. Voldemort's entire strategy throughout the Second Wizarding War showed a frightening awareness of magical undercurrents and power shifts. When he hid one of his Horcruxes in the Room of Requirement, a place that transforms itself constantly and yields to the desires of its user, he knew, almost subconsciously, that no ordinary witch or wizard would be able to uncover it. He did not place traps based on mechanical cunning. He placed them based on an inner knowledge of magical patterns and the psychology of seekers. The diadem, concealed in a place tied to Hogwarts' subconscious, was protected not just by enchantments, but by the notion that only someone on the exact magical wavelength could even find it. His sensitivity to magical anomalies revealed itself most potently in his connection with Harry Potter. From the moment he attempted to kill the baby who would become his nemesis, Voldemort sensed something had gone wrong, not just because his body was destroyed, but because the magical threads had twisted. When he returned in Goblet of Fire, he admitted to Harry, "I miscalculated, my wand did not work properly against yours, I had not foreseen it." And yet, even before Dumbledore began uncovering the truth of the twin cause, Voldemort knew something was wrong. His intuition told him that Harry was not simply a lucky boy who had escaped death. He was part of something deeper, a disturbance in the currents of magic that Voldemort could feel like a storm on the horizon. He feared prophecy not because he believed it, but because it echoed his own unspoken certainties. The prophecy about the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord terrified him not as a mystical truth, but as a confirmation of what he already knew in his bones. He sensed that Harry was part of a design he couldn't control. He tried to twist fate by attacking the prophecy's target preemptively, choosing Harry over Neville, as if driven by an internal compass that pointed toward danger. It wasn't logic. It wasn't even fear. It was a kind of magical premonition, unspoken but inescapable. In Order of the Phoenix, Voldemort sets a trap for Harry at the Department of Mysteries, but the entire plan is wrapped in his growing frustration with the magical link he doesn't understand. He sends visions to Harry, manipulates his thoughts, and uses their connection as a weapon. But he does not do so with confidence. He does so with a kind of desperate compulsion, as though the magic itself is dragging him forward. He cannot see the end, but he feels it. When the prophecy orb is shattered, Voldemort is enraged, not simply because the knowledge is lost, but because he wanted confirmation of what he already suspected. He needed the prophecy to speak aloud what he already carried in his gut. This magical intuition even extended to the Elder Wand. After murdering Snape, Voldemort says, "I was mistaken. The wand's allegiance lies with another." He realized too late that something was wrong with the wand, but his failure to master it was never just about the rules of ownership. It was the wand itself, a sentient, magical object, resisting him. And again, Voldemort could feel this. The Elder Wand obeyed out of fear, perhaps, but never with full loyalty. Voldemort felt that resistance. He sensed that the wand's true master was still alive, and his failure to understand why only proved that his instincts had limits when coloured by arrogance. There is a moment in Deathly Hallows when Voldemort stands alone in the Forbidden Forest, waiting for Harry to approach. He does not know the details. He has not read a book on sacrificial magic or traced Lily's protective charm across the decades, but he knows something is coming. He does not pace. He does not rant. He stands quiet, wand in hand, as if the forest itself whispers of the moment approaching, the moment when the boy he could never fully understand will walk to his death willingly. Voldemort does not know this, but he senses it, the silence before the storm. His magical instinct, refined by decades of dark study, hums with a warning even he cannot interpret. Even during the Battle of Hogwarts, Voldemort makes decisions that reflect his eerie sensitivity. He retreats to the Shrieking Shack not simply for strategy, but because he wants isolation, silence, a place to feel the battle's tide. He is a general guided not by tactical maps, but by the rhythm of magic itself. And when Harry returns from the dead, resurrected by a magic Voldemort could never comprehend, it shatters his worldview, not because it's unexpected, but because it confirms what he always feared. That destiny exists, that some things lie beyond control, that magic responds not only to power, but to sacrifice, love, and intention. Nagini, his last Horcrux, is kept near him, not just as a guardian, but because Voldemort senses her importance. When she is killed, he screams, not in rage alone, but in despair. Something in him breaks. His magical intuition, always buzzing beneath the surface, recognizes instantly that the balance has shifted, that he is no longer protected, that death is finally near. There are no calculations in that scream. It is the scream of a man who knows before he sees, who feels before he falls. What makes Voldemort's intuition so terrifying is that it is not rooted in empathy or emotion. It is raw, magical awareness. It's the sense that a storm is coming long before clouds form. It's what allowed him to avoid assassination attempts, to sidestep betrayal, to gather allies who feared him before he even spoke. He did not read people. He absorbed them, felt the tremors of their intentions, detected shifts in their loyalty like a spider in a web. Dumbledore understood this power better than anyone. In Half-Blood Prince, he warns Harry that Voldemort is perhaps the most dangerous wizard who ever lived, not because of brute strength or intellect or cruelty, but because of a kind of awareness that no one could match. Voldemort may not have believed in love, but he believed in currents of power, and he followed them with the obsession of a prophet. Voldemort never trusted the future because deep down he felt it. And that is why he feared the prophecy, not as a mystery to be solved, but as an echo of what he already knew. He wanted to silence it, destroy it, control it, because it sang too loudly of a truth buried in his soul, that magic itself had already judged him, that he was not the master of death, but its servant, that some outcomes could be felt long before they came to pass. Number 19. Weaponizing fear. There was a time when the name alone could silence an entire room. "You know who," they would whisper, afraid that speaking it aloud might draw his attention like moths to cursed fire. This was no ordinary superstition. Lord Voldemort's power thrived on fear in a way more insidious than any unforgivable curse. It wasn't just that people feared him. It was that fear itself became his weapon, his sustenance, his shadow army. In a world of wands and wards, Voldemort discovered something far more powerful than any incantation: the raw, paralyzing, infectious fear of the unknown. He didn't merely terrify individuals. He engineered a culture of dread. When the wizarding world awoke to news of the Potter's murder, they wept, not only for the victims, but for the cruel reminder that no door was strong enough, no spell protective enough. People weren't just afraid of Voldemort the man. They were afraid of the idea of him. Fear spread like a contagion, infiltrating newspapers, living rooms, and even bedtime stories. Children were warned to never wander too far. Adults double-checked their doors and watched the sky for signs. It wasn't just survival instinct, it was Voldemort's design. What the films only hint at, and what the books circle but never say outright, is that Voldemort's true strength lay not in his magic, but in his understanding of psychology. When he cursed the name Voldemort so that it became a tracking jinx, he weaponized speech itself. Even the most valiant members of the Order of the Phoenix, like Remus Lupin and Kingsley Shacklebolt, avoided saying it. It wasn't cowardice, it was the rational choice in a war where fear had been embedded into the very structure of language. Dumbledore, who insisted on saying the name, stood as the lone wizard resisting that web of silence. "Fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself," he told Harry, but by then most had already succumbed. The fear Voldemort sowed wasn't passive. It crippled entire institutions. The Ministry of Magic, bloated and bureaucratic as it was, collapsed from within not because of spells or curses, but because its officials were too afraid to act decisively. Cornelius Fudge, in his desperate denial of Voldemort's return, gave the Dark Lord all the time he needed to rebuild. When Rufus Scrimgeour finally took the reins, his rhetoric was bold, but the rot of fear was too deep. It had paralyzed their ability to tell the truth, to unify the magical community, or even to admit that war had returned. Voldemort hadn't even stepped into the ministry yet, and it was already crumbling. Hogwarts, the last bastion of hope, suffered a similar fate. Though fortified with charms, protected by ancient magic, and led by Dumbledore himself, even the castle was not immune to the invisible siege. When students whispered rumors of the Dark Lord's rise and parents pulled their children from the school, the very walls seemed to hold their breath. Fear divided the houses, made enemies of friends, and encouraged silence in place of resistance. It wasn't until Voldemort physically took control that the school fully fell, but by then the emotional groundwork had long been laid. He didn't need to blast the gates open. The terror inside did the work for him. The most chilling proof of Voldemort's mastery over fear was seen not in open battle, but in the subtle submission of powerful wizards. Take Horace Slughorn, a brilliant potions master, who had once bragged about teaching the most gifted students. In truth, Slughorn was a deeply frightened man hiding behind his social circles and evasions. When Harry tried to recover the memory that revealed Voldemort's knowledge of Horcruxes, Slughorn resisted not because of loyalty, but because of dread. "I would rather die than tell you," he told the boy. It wasn't Voldemort's wrath he feared. It was the weight of having helped birth such evil. Voldemort didn't even need to threaten him. The shame and terror in Slughorn's heart were already doing the damage. Fear was a disease Voldemort spread with surgical precision. His Death Eaters were not merely followers, but living embodiments of this strategy. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps the most fanatical among them, didn't just torture and kill. She inflicted trauma, as she did, to Neville Longbottom's parents. The Longbottoms were not murdered. They were broken, left alive, but empty, a constant reminder to others of what happened to those who resisted. Voldemort didn't ask Bellatrix to spare them. He let the message carry. He didn't just destroy bodies, he destroyed spirits, and in doing so he gained power over those who watched. Even Harry, brave and self-sacrificing as he was, fell victim to Voldemort's weaponized fear. In the Deathly Hallows, as they camped across England searching for Horcruxes, the trio was plagued not only by physical danger, but by rising despair. The locket, a fragment of Voldemort's soul, magnified their worst insecurities, turning Ron against Harry and threatening to fracture their alliance. It wasn't just a cursed object. It was a carrier of Voldemort's ethos: fear, suspicion, isolation. "He's not giving us nightmares," Harry once said. "He's giving us ideas." That was the point. The enemy was not always outside. Sometimes Voldemort planted it inside you. The books never show Voldemort cowering or retreating. He doesn't hide in shadows out of fear, but because shadows are where fear grows. When he appeared in the Ministry's atrium during the duel with Dumbledore, it wasn't just to fight. It was to make a statement. The symbol of government, law, and order was transformed into a battleground. By the time the battle ended, the Ministry had lost more than a few artifacts. It had lost its illusion of safety. Voldemort vanished into thin air, but the memory of his presence lingered like smoke. The fear he left behind lasted longer than any spell. When Voldemort killed charity workers, tortured Muggleborns, or murdered Cedric Diggory, the magical impact was secondary to the emotional. These weren't strategic attacks, they were performances of terror. His goal wasn't just to win, it was to shatter hope. Cedric's death during the Triwizard Tournament wasn't necessary, but it turned a game into a massacre. It took a school event and drenched it in blood. Voldemort returned not with a bang, but with a question hanging in the air. If he can kill a child here, what can he do anywhere? Even his Horcruxes were crafted with psychological precision. Each one was hidden in a place designed to evoke fear, repulsion, or pain. The cave by the sea, guarded by Inferi, was not just protected, it was traumatic. Dumbledore himself, a wizard of immense willpower, was reduced to sobbing and begging for death when he drank the potion guarding the locket. "It's all my fault, please kill me," he whispered. Voldemort had created not just a trap, but an emotional prison. The potion didn't kill, it exposed the drinker's worst memories, fears, and regrets. Voldemort had found a way to make magic hurt the soul. Perhaps the most terrifying part of Voldemort's power was that it didn't die with him. Even after his defeat, the echoes of fear remained. Children born after the war still grew up hearing his name in hushed tones. Some wizarding families never fully recovered. Magical law enforcement had to rebuild not just infrastructure, but trust. Voldemort may have been buried, but fear, once seeded, takes generations to uproot. His victory wasn't in the time he reigned. It was in how long it took the world to heal from his reign. There's a reason Harry was the perfect foil to Voldemort. Not because he was the chosen one, or even because he was powerful. It was because he learned how to move through fear without becoming it. Voldemort tried to infect others with his dread, but Harry, by walking willingly into the Forbidden Forest, unarmed and prepared to die, did what Voldemort never could. He accepted fear and broke its spell. In that act, Voldemort lost his strongest weapon. As long as someone refuses to be afraid, his power falters. Voldemort's magic was formidable, yes, but his true legacy, the one that haunted portraits and filled history books, was the fear he conjured from silence, doubt, and despair. The films gave us his cruelty, the books showed his cunning, but the deeper magic, the kind only seen in the cracks of shattered courage, was the art of turning fear itself into an empire that stood tall without walls, without soldiers, without even a name. Only a shadow stretching long across a frightened world. Number 20. Alteration of magical creatures. Few wizards in magical history were capable of altering magical creatures in the way Lord Voldemort did, not merely taming or training them, but fundamentally changing them. While the films depict Voldemort as a snake-like, terrifying dark wizard who commands deadly followers and terrifying spells, they fail to illustrate one of his most obscure yet most terrifying talents, the transformation and manipulation of magical beings. This isn't simply the domain of controlling or commanding, like Hagrid's affection for creatures or even Newt Scamander's expertise. It's a dark art of modification, contamination, and creation. Voldemort, unlike others, did not only surround himself with loyal beings, he forged them. He made them into extensions of his own essence. And nowhere is this more evident than in Nagini. Nagini is often remembered as Voldemort's snake, his eerie companion, slithering beside him in dark chambers and battlefields. But her true nature, hinted only faintly in the books and nearly ignored by the films, suggests something far deeper and more haunting. She was not simply a serpent. Dumbledore, in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, calls her a Horcrux. But even that is not the whole story. Nagini, he says, appears to have a close connection with Voldemort, perhaps more than any of the others. Her mind, her loyalty, her understanding of commands, these were beyond what a normal snake, even a magical one, could achieve. Some theorists suggest she was once human, a maledictus, which might be true, but Voldemort did more than just accept her. He changed her. It is known that Voldemort was fascinated by serpents long before he became the Dark Lord. As a Parselmouth, he spoke with them from childhood, but Nagini was different. She was bound to him through magic far deeper than language. Her role as a Horcrux required her to be more than a beast. It required her to be a vessel, one strong enough to contain a fragment of the darkest soul in existence. The soul of Tom Riddle, divided and twisted, needed a powerful container. In order for Nagini to fulfill that purpose, Voldemort likely altered her, using dark and forgotten magic, possibly from ancient texts locked deep within the Department of Mysteries or recovered from the ruins of Nurmengard. The nature of Horcruxes demands a vessel capable of holding not only dark magic, but part of a human soul. Most wizards used objects, the locket of Salazar Slytherin, Hufflepuff's cup, or the ring of the Gaunts. But to place a soul inside a living creature is different. It implies a higher level of magical fusion. It implies manipulation of the creature's mind, body, and spirit. Nagini's fierce intelligence, a protective behavior toward Voldemort, her understanding of complex instructions, all of it suggests that she had been transformed. She is valuable, Voldemort says in the Deathly Hallows. I must keep her safe. This wasn't mere affection, this was possession in the truest sense. Nagini wasn't just a Horcrux, she was also a sentinel, a guardian, and at times a weapon. When Arthur Weasley was attacked in the Department of Mysteries, it was through Nagini's bite. But it wasn't a random act of animal aggression. The attack had a purpose. Voldemort was using her like a magical extension of himself, not only seeing through her eyes, but directing her actions with surgical precision. Hermione in The Half-Blood Prince says, "It was like he was possessing her." And that is what sets Nagini apart from all other magical companions. She wasn't a pet. She was part of him, physically and magically altered to carry his intent. But Nagini is only one example. There are others, more hidden, but equally disturbing. The inferi, corpses reanimated by dark magic, are often described as mindless puppets, yet the ones Voldemort used during the First and Second Wizarding Wars had traits unlike those described in textbooks. The cave where the locket Horcrux was hidden held a lake full of them. Dumbledore says, "These bodies have been bewitched, but they will not die because they are already dead." That alone is horrifying, but what made Voldemort's inferi different was their organization, their purpose, and their brutal cohesion. They didn't merely lash out, they coordinated, they waited, they obeyed. And that suggests something more than necromancy, it suggests transformation. Ordinary inferi stumble and groan. They move without thought, animated by spells that simulate life. But Voldemort's creations were more. They exhibited pattern, waited in silence, acted only when the locket was disturbed. They followed rules. Inferi are not supposed to understand tactics, these did. The magic used must have been augmented, reinforced with something ancient, the kind of dark art that the Ministry refuses to publish, even in the restricted section. He didn't just reanimate, he reforged. Take also the case of the Giants. Voldemort's alliance with them during the Second Wizarding War isn't just a matter of politics or brute force. According to Hagrid in the Order of the Phoenix, the Giants were hesitant, difficult to persuade, angry, and chaotic. And yet Voldemort managed to bring them to his cause. The theory that he used dark enchantments to bind them, perhaps to even modify their minds or pain thresholds, has been circulating among unspeakables and curse-breakers alike. When the Giants fought at Hogwarts, they did not fight like a wild herd. They struck in unison, often under cover of spells that someone had taught them to avoid or resist. These weren't natural behaviors, these were signs of magical training or magical transformation. Even the werewolves under Fenrir Greyback's command behaved unnaturally during the war. Lupin once noted that Greyback has been twisted. He infects for pleasure. But there's more to it. Some reports suggest that under Voldemort's regime, Greyback and his pack grew stronger, more resistant to traditional magical barriers. Some Aurors believed they were being enhanced, perhaps using blood rituals or experimental potion work. Some dark alchemy designed by Voldemort himself or one of his inner circle. The monsters became more monstrous, not just because of hate, but because of planned mutation. What makes Voldemort's manipulation of magical beings so frightening is that it wasn't just strategic, it was deeply personal. He viewed magical creatures not as allies, but as tools, as ingredients, as molds to be reshaped in his vision. Where Dumbledore sought understanding and peaceful coexistence, Voldemort sought dominance through transformation. He didn't want creatures to aid him. He wanted them to become him. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this power is how Voldemort mirrored mythic figures from old magical lore, wizards who created golems or twisted beasts from ancient times. There are whispers that Voldemort studied the ancient art of soul-binding not only for his Horcruxes, but for creature modification. There are runes, long lost and banned by the Department of Mysteries, that are said to rewire the essence of magical beings. Voldemort, with his obsession for immortality and control, may have uncovered them. When Voldemort rose again, his power seemed greater not only because he had no nose or travelled via smoke. It was because his army was not made of ordinary dark wizards. It included creatures no one had seen in such forms before, Nagini as a living Horcrux, inferi that followed orders like trained soldiers, werewolves whose bites corrupted faster, giants who obeyed spells. These were not coincidences. These were signs of mastery over something that terrifies even the darkest minds, the transformation of life itself. The books give us only glimpses of this power. In the Deathly Hallows, when Voldemort keeps Nagini close in a magical bubble, guarded and preserved, we see not affection, but obsession with his creation. He knows she is precious, not as a snake, but as a vessel he has engineered. "She must be kept safe," he says, "so I can finish this once and for all." It's not just about the Horcrux, it's about what she is now, a masterpiece of dark art. What is chilling is that none of these creatures ever rebel. None falter. Nagini never flees. The Inferi never forget. The giants do not question. This is not loyalty. This is transformation so complete that the creature's essence has been overwritten. Voldemort didn't simply gather beasts, he reforged the laws of magical nature. To understand Voldemort is to understand that his war wasn't just against the Ministry or Dumbledore, it was a war against natural law, against the barriers that separate wizard from beast, life from death, mind from spell. Through transformation, he sought to own the very essence of magic. He didn't stop at bending humans. He bent magic itself, twisting the creatures that dwell within it into shadows of himself. And in doing so, he revealed a horrifying truth, that the darkest magic is not the one that kills, but the one that remakes. Number 21. Soul-based immortality research. In the darkest corners of the wizarding world, Tom Riddle was never simply a villain seeking power. His ambition cut deeper than politics or bloodlines. It pierced the nature of existence itself. Unlike Dumbledore, who embraced the mystery of death as a natural part of life, Voldemort saw mortality as a flaw, a defect in the magical condition. From a young age, he was not just terrified of death, he was insulted by it. The idea that someone as gifted, as superior, as singular as he could one day vanish into oblivion was intolerable. So he began to study not how to survive physically, but how to fragment, distort, and ultimately transcend the very idea of a soul. The creation of Horcruxes was only the surface of Voldemort's research. While the books mention the making of 7 soul containers, they barely touch on the scope of what this act truly meant. It wasn't just dark magic, it was a philosophical rebellion. In Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore muses, Lord Voldemort liked to collect trophies. You saw the box in the cave, Harry. The locket of Slytherin. He wanted the Horcruxes to be hard to find, hard to destroy. But even this observation doesn't reveal the full scale of Voldemort's obsession. He wasn't merely hiding parts of himself, he was dismembering his very essence and tethering it to artifacts that resonated with power, lineage, and symbolic permanence. These weren't just trophies, they were metaphysical anchors. One must not forget that the act of creating a Horcrux is said to cause such agony that it tears the soul apart. This detail, mentioned by Slughorn in a trembling voice, is often overshadowed by the shock value of the act itself. But Voldemort did not stop at one. He deliberately endured, or perhaps transcended, this soul-mangling ritual 6 times. That raises a deeper question. What happens to a soul after it's been torn repeatedly? Does it retain coherence? Does it still recognize itself? The malformed creature Harry saw in King's Cross, a whimpering, flayed horror, was not simply a side effect of the curse rebounding. It was the logical endpoint of Voldemort's philosophy. He had stretched his soul so far from human that even death recoiled from it. There's a curious passage in Deathly Hallows when Harry speaks to Dumbledore in that bright purgatorial train station. The elder wizard tells him, "You were the 7th Horcrux, Harry, the Horcrux he never meant to make." And yet, the deeper truth is left unsaid. Harry had carried a fragment of Voldemort's soul for years, and in that time it had fed off his life. But Voldemort too had paid a price for this imbalance. His own soul had become so disjointed that it no longer functioned in harmony. Even Nagini, his final Horcrux, required continuous control and protection. This wasn't immortality, it was parasitic survival, a soul without a center, scattered like ashes on cursed winds. Yet Voldemort had done more than mutilate himself. He had experimented with the very boundaries of consciousness. When his body was destroyed in Godric's Hollow, he did not die in the traditional sense. He became, as he later described, less than spirit, less than the meanest ghost, but still alive. His soul, untethered from flesh, drifted in a state of torment and awareness. This wasn't a mere echo or a magical imprint. It was an identity, disembodied but intact, sustained by dark rituals and sheer will. For a decade he survived as vapor and memory, attaching himself to animals, drinking unicorn blood, hiding in forests like a cursed wind. No wizard before him had managed such a thing, not even the darkest of ancient warlocks. The encounter with Professor Quirrell was no accident. Voldemort had already mastered a technique few dared to name, possession of the living by fragments of self. Quirrell, weak and fearful, was the ideal vessel, but Voldemort's control went far beyond simple parasitism. He reshaped Quirrell's mind, spoke through his mouth, even shared his body in reverse. This wasn't mind control, it was soul invasion, a fusion so intense that Quirrell burned on contact with Harry's skin. This wasn't only due to Lily's protection, it was because Voldemort's soul had no buffer. It was raw, unstable, allergic to purity. In Albania, Voldemort had already begun experimenting with more obscure forms of immortality. The Book of Spells later hinted that ancient sorcerers once tried to dissolve their identities into natural elements, winds, rivers, the bones of the earth. Voldemort echoed this myth. He did not anchor himself to the cosmos, but to legacy. Each Horcrux was a symbol, Ravenclaw's diadem, Hufflepuff's cup, representing eternal relevance, as if he believed that meaning itself could protect his soul. It wasn't just about staying alive, it was about being remembered, being everywhere, being inevitable. Even his resurrection was alchemical. In Goblet of Fire, the ritual used for his rebirth, the flesh of the servant, bone of the father, blood of the enemy, is a dark mirror of symbolic rebirth, a travesty of Christian resurrection themes. He did not merely return, he remade his body from death, binding his soul once more to the physical plane. But the new body was not normal. Its skin was snake-like, its veins filled with poison. This was not resurrection. This was necromantic engineering. He had overcome death, but at the cost of humanity. The books never clarify how Voldemort knew these rituals. No Hogwarts curriculum covers Horcruxes in such depth. The Room of Requirement hides the only known book that mentions the term, and even that is vague. But Voldemort, as a student, found what others missed. He visited the forbidden section in the library, charmed professors, interrogated ghosts. It's likely he discovered lost texts, perhaps the magic Moste Evil, or the Scrolls of Morgana, that detailed rituals so disturbing that even the darkest witches burned the pages. In Chamber of Secrets, Dumbledore notes that Voldemort was perhaps the most brilliant student Hogwarts has ever seen. That brilliance was not just academic, it was existential. And still, he feared. His entire empire of terror, his army of Death Eaters, his control over magical institutions, these were not the acts of a confident immortal. They were the panicked defenses of a man whose soul screamed every time he closed his eyes. He feared prophecy, he feared children, he feared love. That's why his downfall began not with a spell, but with a mother's sacrifice. Lily Potter did not curse him, she refused to step aside, and in that refusal Voldemort's soul met something it could not process. Unselfish death. It recoiled, shattered, and inadvertently planted a seed of itself into the one it tried to destroy. The final confrontation at Hogwarts was not merely a battle of wands, it was a battle of philosophies. Voldemort, armed with centuries of dark wisdom, could not understand why his spells failed, why the Elder Wand rejected him, why death came for him despite all his precautions. Because he misunderstood the soul. He believed it to be a possession, a tool to manipulate, divide, and control. But the soul in the world of Harry Potter is relational. It binds itself to others through love, loyalty, remorse, and Voldemort had none of these. When Harry returns from the dead, after walking willingly to his supposed end, he does not find Voldemort waiting in hell. He finds the remnant, the childlike bleeding thing beneath the bench. Dumbledore says, "Do not pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living, and above all, those who live without love." That creature is Voldemort's soul, unfinished, unhealed, and unclaimed, not destroyed because death had no language left to speak with it. This is the secret the films do not explore and the books only whisper. Voldemort did not cheat death, he corrupted it so deeply that when his time finally came, even the afterlife could not absorb him. He became a spiritual orphan, denied rest, denied rebirth, denied even judgment. And that is perhaps the greatest horror, not dying but surviving in a form no longer human, no longer capable of being whole. In seeking eternal life, Voldemort secured eternal exile. He may be the greatest dark wizard of all time, but his legacy is not one of fear or power. It is a warning, for even in a world of magic, the soul is sacred, and when you treat it like a weapon, it turns on you. Number 22, breaking magical protections. In the shadowed history of the wizarding world, few names provoke as much fear and awe as that of Lord Voldemort. Yet, while his cruelty, Horcruxes, and serpentine presence dominate conversations, one of his most terrifying talents remains largely overlooked: his unmatched ability to dismantle magical protections. Though never fully detailed in the films and only touched upon obliquely in the books, Voldemort was not merely a powerful wizard, he was a masterful breaker of magical defenses. His understanding of protective enchantments went far beyond brute force. He approached magical barriers not as obstacles, but as complex locks, begging to be undone by a superior intellect. Like acid that eats through iron, Voldemort's magic corroded spells that even the most skilled witches and wizards thought impenetrable. When he hunted down James and Lily Potter, they had used one of the most secure enchantments known to the wizarding world, the Fidelius charm. Their secret keeper, Peter Pettigrew, betrayed them, but what remains chilling is Voldemort's ability to locate and breach the charm so effortlessly once he knew the secret. Most wizards, upon hearing the location, would still struggle to find a house hidden under such a powerful charm. Yet Voldemort appeared in Godric's Hollow, entered the magically cloaked residence, and executed the most infamous murders of the era without any resistance from the enchantment. The moment he stepped into that house, centuries of trust in protective magic collapsed. He had, in a single night, invalidated the very concept of magical refuge. Years later, when Harry and Dumbledore sought the locket Horcrux in the seaside cave, the layers of magical protections were astonishing. There were enchantments hiding the entrance, blood magic on the doorway, a potion of agony, and an inferi-filled lake, all tied together by the deeply personal magic of Tom Riddle. And yet, Voldemort himself had entered that cave before them. He had returned after making the Horcrux and ensured that its security would withstand time, pain, and logic. But the terrifying implication is this: he understood each defense well enough to implement it. That cave was not only locked, it was engineered like a death trap, but every element of it spoke of a mind that knew exactly how such protections could be bypassed, if only one was clever enough. When the Death Eaters infiltrated the Ministry of Magic in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, it wasn't through brute violence. They slipped in, unseen, during an era of heightened paranoia. The Ministry had wards against disapparition, intrusion alarms, and even magical identification systems. Still, Voldemort's followers emerged inside the building, like ghosts through walls. What kind of dark enchantments did Voldemort teach them? His presence loomed over the operation. He had discovered how to undermine the very institution meant to guard Wizarding Britain, and by the time the trio infiltrated the Ministry themselves, the entire structure of protection had been turned inside out, bent to Voldemort's will. And then there was Hogwarts, the crown jewel of magical security. Protected by ancient enchantments, living statues, anti-apparition fields, moving staircases, and Dumbledore's personal fortifications, it was considered an impenetrable fortress. But by the end of the 6th book, the Death Eaters were inside its walls. Yes, Draco Malfoy played a crucial role, aided by the Vanishing Cabinet. But the cabinet itself was merely a tool, an instrument that Voldemort had recognized as a crack in the armor. It was his mind, not Draco's, that saw the thread that could be pulled. The deeper truth is that Voldemort's strategic vision turned Hogwarts's defenses into a puzzle to be solved, and once he did, Dumbledore stood exposed on the astronomy tower, ready for the bait fall. Even before he reclaimed his physical form, Voldemort was already testing the limits of magical barriers. When Bertha Jorkins disappeared in Albania, her fate hinted at how easily Voldemort had shattered her mental defenses. She had been subjected to memory charms by Crouch Senior, a form of protection designed to be permanent. But under Voldemort's interrogation, those charms splintered like glass. He tortured her, Dumbledore later said gravely, and extracted enough information to return. To Voldemort, magic of the mind was just another gate to breach. Pain was his key. Another stark example comes from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, when the goblet itself was bewitched. The goblet was supposed to be an impartial, unbreakable magical object, but Voldemort's servant Barty Crouch Jr., under his direction, enchanted it to accept a fourth champion. This wasn't merely trickery, it was the manipulation of a sacred magical artifact, one of the most securely enchanted items in the castle. The enchantments surrounding the Triwizard Tournament had existed for centuries, yet Voldemort's influence corrupted the entire structure from within, showing that there was no institution, no tradition, no law of magic that he couldn't twist to his purposes. Gringotts, the goblin-run bank, was another symbol of security. There's no safer place except Hogwarts, Hagrid had once claimed. Its vaults were protected by dragons, enchanted carts, duplicating curses and spells ancient as time. But when Harry, Hermione and Ron broke into Bellatrix Lestrange's vault, they did so using dark knowledge from Griphook and disguises with Polyjuice Potion. Still, the sword of Gryffindor, which replaced the Horcrux, suggests Voldemort had returned to that vault. Had he once again bypassed Gringotts' legendary protections, as he had the cave and the ministry? The very idea of placing a Horcrux in such a vault speaks volumes. Voldemort believed that not even goblin magic could detect or undo what he had concealed within. And he had every reason to believe he was right. Perhaps the most subtle, yet chilling example of his prowess lies in the way he shattered the defenses of people's minds and souls. Legilimency, the ability to read thoughts, is a rare art, but Voldemort used it as if it were breathing. He penetrated minds and projected his presence into them. The Dark Lord is a master of occlumency, Snape warned, the mind arts. But he was more than that. He could crawl inside people, not just reading their thoughts, but leaving pieces of himself behind, like cursed echoes. Possession of Quirrell, invasion of Harry's dreams, the slow unravelling of Ginny through the diary. All of these were magical intrusions into the innermost chambers of identity. Voldemort's magic didn't just break walls, it broke people. This talent was never showy. There were no green flashes or fiery blasts when he unravelled enchantments. His power was subtle, sophisticated, surgical. When he wanted to, he could undo spells older than nations, curses woven over generations, protections that entire magical families had depended on. And he did it again and again as if it were a game. Even the protective blood magic that lived inside Harry, forged from Lily's sacrifice, could not fully resist him in the end. As Dumbledore said, his soul is so mangled he can no longer comprehend love. But that didn't mean he couldn't reach through it, Chigum. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore speaks of Tom Riddle's childhood visit to the cave where he would one day hide a Horcrux. There, the boy made 2 other children suffer, doing things that even Dumbledore could only guess at. That moment reveals something darker than mere cruelty. It hints that even as a child, Voldemort had an instinctive understanding of magical willpower and how to dominate it. By the time he became the Dark Lord, he no longer cast spells. He imposed his will on the world. It is no wonder then that the wizarding world lived in fear not just of his name, but of the silence that preceded his arrival. Where others saw spells as barriers, he saw them as invitations. The protections around the Potter house, the magical seals of the Department of Mysteries, the enchantments of Hogwarts and Gringotts. None of them held him. He broke them like threads of cobweb, and with each unravelling he proved that there was no sanctuary, no line of defence that could not be crossed. His mind was a vault of dark knowledge, but it was also a key. He had studied ancient texts, learned from dark artifacts, experimented with forgotten arts. There is little doubt that he surpassed even Grindelwald in this regard. Grindelwald wielded power like a storm, but Voldemort dissected it. He didn't just cast magic, he understood it molecule by molecule. He was the first to see that even the deepest spells had weaknesses, and once he saw the flaw, the rest was inevitable. In the end, Voldemort's downfall came not because he was overpowered, but because he failed to see that some protections are not magical. He underestimated loyalty, friendship, sacrifice, forces that no spell can calculate. But in the realm of enchantments and wards, no one ever matched his precision and force. His legacy is not just one of fear and death, it is the lingering horror that the things we believe to be safe are never truly beyond reach. Not when Voldemort knows the door, the key, and how to make both disappear. Number 23. Consciousness fragmentation. In the shadows of the known story, beneath the duels and the Horcruxes, lies a layer of Voldemort's dark mastery that the films never dared to explore and the books only hinted at in passing. The uncanny art of dividing not just the soul, but consciousness itself. What Tom Riddle achieved went far beyond the mechanical splitting of his soul into 7 cursed fragments. He learned to fracture awareness, to implant living echoes of himself into the world, sentient shards that could act, think, remember, and manipulate, all without the body that once held them. This was not simple possession or the passive influence of a cursed object. It was something more terrifying. The birth of autonomous minds, shadows of Voldemort's true self, spread like a fungus across magical vessels and living beings alike. The diary of Tom Riddle, first seen in the Chamber of Secrets, is the clearest evidence of this hidden art. In the hands of Ginny Weasley, it became a confessional, a friend, a guide, and finally a predator. The diary did not merely store a piece of Voldemort's soul as a traditional Horcrux would. It spoke in Tom's voice, responded to Ginny's thoughts, manipulated her emotionally, and ultimately possessed her. This was not a passive memory like those kept in Dumbledore's Pensieve. The diary had agency. It thought, it planned. Haven't you guessed yet? Ginny's been writing in my diary for months and months, the young Tom said, through ink and illusion, as the real Voldemort remained, a disembodied wraith, far from Hogwarts. This was not a ghost. This was consciousness reborn, a mind living in paper and ink. Such feats demand more than dark rituals and forbidden books. They require the brutal suppression of what it means to be human. Voldemort did not merely seek immortality, he annihilated the boundary between self and vessel. When his body was destroyed in Godric's Hollow, he did not die. His spirit, tattered and incomplete, fled into the forest of Albania and survived by attaching itself to small animals. Later, he possessed snakes and humans, slipping his essence into their minds like poison in wine. In the Goblet of Fire, he resided inside the feeble form of Professor Quirrell, yet even then he remained conscious, alert, and powerful enough to influence events at Hogwarts from behind the professor's turban. "There is no good and evil, there is only power, and those too weak to seek it," Quirrell said, but those were Voldemort's thoughts, whispered through skin and bone. This possession was not simple puppetry. It was dual existence. Quirrell retained some autonomy, some resistance, but Voldemort's mind coiled around his like a serpent. The books never describe Quirrell as a mindless husk. He speaks reasons, even shows fear, yet Voldemort speaks through him, sees through him, commands his limbs. This suggests a terrifying possibility that Voldemort had mastered the ability to project his consciousness while still maintaining a central, aware self. Even in disembodiment, he did not lose himself. He became many. When Nagini slithered into the story, her role at first seemed mundane. A loyal snake, dangerous, but not mysterious. Yet by the Deathly Hallows, readers learned she was more than a pet. She was a living Horcrux, but even that term fails to capture her full role. Voldemort used her eyes, her senses. In the Order of the Phoenix, Harry sees through Nagini as she attacks Arthur Weasley, describing the scene in visceral detail. He was flying through a long corridor in the Department of Mysteries, snakeskin rustling on the floor, fangs bared. Harry was not dreaming, he was perceiving, and Nagini, a creature without a wand or voice, was receiving commands not in words, but through shared consciousness. This implies that Voldemort did not merely store part of his soul in her, he dwelt in her. Even Harry Potter himself became a vessel. Dumbledore later reveals that part of Voldemort's soul latched onto the baby during the failed murder in Godric's Hollow. But again, this fragment was more than a soul shard. It had awareness. Throughout the series, Harry experiences visions, emotions, and impulses that are not his own. In the Order of the Phoenix, after the attack on Arthur, Dumbledore grows visibly disturbed, realizing the link has become dangerous. "He has tried to possess you," Dumbledore says, noting the pain Harry feels and the fury that burns behind his eyes. Voldemort's consciousness, even when fragmented, retained emotion and memory. He could feel anger, experience jealousy, and push those feelings into the minds of others. This power goes beyond traditional dark arts. In fact, no other character in the series exhibits anything remotely similar. Even Grindelwald, Dumbledore's intellectual equal, never divided himself in such a way. No other wizard possesses the ability to simultaneously exist in multiple minds, multiple bodies, and magical containers. Not even the Resurrection Stone or the Mirror of Erised could duplicate this. Those artifacts show visions or summon echoes. Voldemort planted sentient beings. This raises disturbing philosophical questions. If each fragment of Voldemort can think and feel, how many selves existed at once? Was Tom Riddle now a collective mind? It is no coincidence that Voldemort's transformations began when he abandoned the name Tom Riddle. The symbolic erasure of his birth identity paralleled the literal dismantling of his singular self. He no longer desired to be one man. He wished to be many, omnipresent, unconstrained by flesh. His immortality did not rest on a phylactery or a single object, like the Lich of Legend. Instead, he invented a lattice of living minds, distributed across the physical and magical world. His identity became modular. Even the ritual that restored his body in the Goblet of Fire reflects this grotesque metamorphosis. Using Harry's blood, Wormtail's flesh, and his father's bone, Voldemort forged a vessel strong enough to contain what was left of his core. But the body was not the key. His mind had never been fully gone. He returns not as an amnesiac or disoriented ghost, but fully formed, with memories intact, rage sharpened, and goals unchanged. He speaks of his own rebirth in precise terms, aware of every moment of disembodied existence. "I was ripped from my body. I was less than spirit, less than the meanest ghost," he tells his Death Eaters. But even as less than ghost, he had thought, planned, waited. It is no wonder that those closest to him feared not just his power, but his presence. Lucius Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange, even Snape, none were certain whether Voldemort could hear or see from afar. He was never truly absent. Even in silence, his mind might dwell in a mirror, a ring, a cursed locket, or a girl's trembling hands holding an old diary. His enemies never knew when they were alone. This terror was not paranoia. It was practical fear of a man who had made himself into a legion of selves. The films, focused on visual spectacle, missed the horror in this idea. They showed the Horcruxes as objects to be found and destroyed, ignoring the philosophical rot that came with them. The books, in contrast, give eerie hints. Dumbledore's remarks about the diary being a horcrux of a most unusual kind, and his concern that Harry had more in common with Voldemort than he should, point to this greater mystery, the multiplicity of Voldemort's mind. Rowling never states outright that Voldemort mastered the splitting of consciousness, but every narrative thread from Quirrell's surrender to the diary's manipulation, from Nagini's second sight to Harry's intrusive visions, suggests it. Only a will like Voldemort's could maintain so many fractures without crumbling into madness. Only a mind trained to deny morality, empathy, and unity could wield such division without losing coherence. He did not become insane, he became plural. Each fragment was a specialist: the diary, manipulator; the locket, deceiver; the ring, whisperer of bloodlines; Nagini, assassin; Harry, the unwilling observer. Together they formed a network of awareness, not unlike the hive minds imagined in Muggle science fiction, but darker, conscious of itself as the sum of many sins. The Elder Wand in the hands of Voldemort never reached its full potential, for despite his mastery of death and power, the wand was made for a singular wizard. Voldemort was no longer one. This is why the wand refused him in the end. Its allegiance required unity, and Voldemort had long since ceased to be a single being. When Harry met him in the Forbidden Forest, what stood before him was not a man, but the culmination of every mental fracture, stitched into a body by blood and dark rites. Even in death, Voldemort left behind echoes. The fragment that had lived inside Harry perished with a scream, writhing on the floor of King's Cross Station, small, naked, and flayed. But others may yet linger, pieces in unburned books, dust-covered relics, or forgotten corners of the magical world. For a mind so divided is difficult to truly destroy. Voldemort reinvented consciousness itself, turning identity into a spell, personality into a contagion, and perhaps somewhere even now something of him watches. Number 24. Harnessing the magic of locations. In the shadowed heart of the wizarding world lies a truth scarcely whispered, a power Voldemort mastered in silence, the magic of place. Unlike the blunt force of curses or the flair of dueling, this discipline was not taught at Hogwarts. It belonged to the old ways, whispered through centuries, forgotten by most. Voldemort, with his insatiable hunger for control and dominance, reached into the earth itself, bent its invisible threads of power, and molded the essence of a location to serve his will. His understanding of magical geography, of ley lines, and the energy humming beneath ancient soil was as rare as it was dangerous. The cave where he hid the Horcrux, the locket once belonging to Salazar Slytherin, was not chosen for its inaccessibility alone. That salt-scoured crevice by the sea, carved by centuries of relentless waves, pulsed with something darker. It was a place where despair hung like fog, and the air tasted of forgotten screams. Voldemort infused it further with enchantments, cursed water, inferi, illusions, but the cave itself already carried the weight of death and desolation. Dumbledore recognized this. He said, "This place has known magic, very dark magic." But what he didn't say, what the books only hint at, is that Voldemort hadn't just cursed a location. He had awakened something ancient within it and tethered it to his soul. The theory of geomagic, or ley-based sorcery, is not found in standard Hogwarts curriculum, yet Voldemort, ever the seeker of forbidden knowledge, likely uncovered it through his obsession with the founders, particularly Salazar Slytherin. Slytherin, a wizard of the old blood, would have understood the currents of magic that threaded through the earth like veins. By following in his footsteps, Tom Riddle unearthed more than a basilisk beneath the castle. He uncovered a tradition of magical manipulation rooted in the land itself. The Chamber of Secrets was not only a hidden room, it was a node, a place where power pooled unnaturally, responding to certain bloodlines, amplifying their magic, distorting others. Hogwarts itself sat atop one of these nodes. While most treated it as mere coincidence that the greatest school of magic thrived there, Voldemort knew better. When he attempted to claim the castle in the final battle, it was not simply about conquering Dumbledore's legacy or eliminating Harry Potter. It was about dominance over one of the most potent magical nexuses in Britain. When he walked its halls, he did not merely see a fortress, he felt the pulse of ancient magic beneath the stones, the breath of the founders lingering in its walls. It is no surprise, then, that he used the Room of Requirement, a place already resonant with the will of magic itself, as a hiding place for another fragment of his soul. This mastery was not always overt. The Albanian forest where he took refuge after his fall was not chosen at random. Though broken and near death, his soul fragment, tethered to the earth, drew him to a place where the veil between life and death thinned. The forest, ancient and damp, with air thick as grave soil, became a cradle for his partial resurrection. He lingered near the tomb of a forgotten sorcerer, a location radiating old and volatile magic. This was not survival by chance, it was survival by alignment. Even in near death, Voldemort gravitated to places that would amplify what little strength he possessed. Like a parasite returning to a host of raw power, he knew instinctively where to root himself. Malfoy Manor, the eventual seat of his reborn power, was not merely the home of influential purebloods. The estate, old and regal, sat atop centuries of rituals, secrets, and ancestral pride. Its drawing room, where he held court, carried the cold echo of generations. Narcissa's whispered prayers, Lucius's desperate ambitions, and Draco's fear all became part of the charged atmosphere. But under Voldemort's hand, the very walls changed. The magic of the place, dormant, restrained, awakened to his presence, becoming sharp, heavy. Even Bellatrix Lestrange seemed more manic there, more violent. Voldemort wasn't just using the house, he was reshaping it. The manor became an extension of him, ornate, cruel, choking. To manipulate places, to manipulate people. Voldemort understood that the psyche bends under atmospheric pressure. When the air itself turns against you, when the floorboards creak, not from age, but from intention, even the strongest minds falter. The cave didn't merely guard a Horcrux, it induced hopelessness. Gringotts' vault was enchanted with burning touch and multiplying treasures, yes, but the claustrophobia and rising panic of the depths played their part. And then, at Hogwarts, during the battle, the castle itself groaned and trembled, not just from spells, but from a kind of mourning. The castle fought for Harry not merely because it was his home, but because Voldemort had tried to twist its nature. That resistance was ancient magic, rising like blood to the skin. What few notice is that Voldemort did not act alone in sensing these energies. Albus Dumbledore, though guided by light rather than shadow, also understood the soul of places. He too was drawn to Hogwarts' depths. He too felt the pain in the cave. But Dumbledore respected the land's voice. Voldemort sought to silence it and reprogram it. When he created the protective enchantments in the cave, he didn't merely guard the locket. He synchronized the cave's inherent malevolence with his own. The Inferi were not only guardians, they were part of the cave's new identity, extensions of its corrupted nature. Even the Forbidden Forest played a role in this mastery. During the Second Wizarding War, Voldemort chose the forest as the place for his temporary camp and the execution ground for Harry. A decision rooted not only in concealment but in domination. The forest, home to centaurs, acromantulas, and ancient secrets, had its own aura, watchful, neutral, unpredictable. Voldemort attempted to imprint himself upon it, to desecrate it with death, as he had other places. But the forest resisted in its own quiet way. When the centaurs joined the final battle, it was not simply allegiance to Hogwarts, it was a defense of their ancient grove, now stained by Voldemort's blood rituals. The manipulation of magical space allowed Voldemort to do what most wizards could not. His spells lasted longer, his curses spread wider. The taboo on his name, which tracked speakers instantly, was more than a clever enchantment. It was a curse anchored to a vast network of magical touchpoints throughout Britain. He turned the very air of the country into a net. Saying Voldemort became a way of stepping into his invisible trap, a trap that responded not with physical walls but with awareness. That required more than dark magic. It required a mapping of ley lines, a placing of sentinels, and a knowledge of magical acoustics few ever imagined. In the Department of Mysteries, the Room of Death, the Hall of Prophecy, Voldemort saw not only threats but potential. These rooms, steeped in focused magic, represented opportunities to twist fate. When he sent Harry into the trap to retrieve the prophecy, it was more than bait. It was about manipulating the energies of destiny itself. If Harry died in that room, where time distorted and whispers filled the air, the symbolic magic would have made the act near irreversible. Voldemort sought not only to kill, but to kill where the act could not be undone. After his return, Voldemort moved like a phantom from place to place, each step deliberate, each lair resonant. His final occupation of Hogwarts was a calculated ritual. He didn't merely break into the castle, he desecrated its meaning. He walked freely in the Great Hall, took up space where generations had dined and dreamed, and when he broadcast his voice across the grounds, it wasn't just with magic, it was with amplified authority drawn from the castle's bones. His demand for Harry was not just a threat, it was a declaration made from the heart of a conquered sanctuary. Even his own body, a creation of dark alchemy, was tied to place. Reborn in a cauldron in a graveyard, where bones of his father fed the spell, he aligned his resurrection with a convergence of symbols, lineage, betrayal, death, and rebirth. The graveyard, already humming with the unquiet dead, became the crucible of his return. Wormtail's knife, Harry's blood, and the earth that had swallowed Tom Riddle Sr. all mingled. The result was not simply a return to flesh, it was the ultimate statement of control over history, family, and the land itself. Voldemort's fall was dramatic, but even then, the spaces he touched retained echoes of him. The cave remains sealed, trembling with curses. The Albanian forest bears the scars of unnatural storms. Malfoy Manor, for all its pride, is quieter now, but the cold has never quite left. And Hogwarts, though healed, remembers. The Room of Requirement burned not only from fiend fire, but from centuries of magic finally pushed to its limit. The room destroyed itself, not to stop Crabbe, but to erase Voldemort's imprint. It was a rebellion, silent and absolute. In the end, Voldemort's legacy is not only found in the scars of his victims, but in the places he altered. He treated the world as a chessboard of power points, each one a potential stronghold, each one a weapon. And while others fought with spells, he fought with gravity, with atmosphere, with the unseen threads that tie a wizard to the land. That is why his death, though final, leaves behind echoes. Because Voldemort did not just cast magic, he became part of the magical landscape. And in the places he touched, the air still remembers him. Number 25. Crafting magical traps. In the shadowed corners of the magical world, Voldemort's brilliance as a dark wizard is often attributed to his mastery of the dark arts, his obsession with immortality, and his formidable skill in dueling. But there is a more arcane and subtle talent of his that both the films and many readers overlook, his mastery of magical traps. This was no mere use of hexes or basic jinxes. Voldemort engineered enchantments that were layered, interlocked, and psychologically crushing. It was this almost architectural precision in trap-making that transformed his Horcruxes from hidden artifacts into cursed fortresses, each a small hell unto itself. When Albus Dumbledore and Harry Potter ventured into the cave to retrieve what they believed was Salazar Slytherin's locket, they encountered more than just an artifact. The cave was not simply protected, it was designed to break the intruder. A boat that could only carry a limited weight, an enchantment that demanded a blood offering to open the door, a potion that induced unbearable psychological torment. And beneath the still surface of the lake, an army of inferi waited in silence. Voldemort didn't simply want to kill, he wanted to unmake his enemies piece by piece, beginning with their mind. The horror of the potion was not in its taste, but in its memory. As Dumbledore drank it, his pleas echoed off the stone walls. "Don't hurt them, please. Hurt me instead." It wasn't poison in the traditional sense. It was memory weaponized, fear resurrected. Voldemort crafted this to exploit trauma, to resurrect the worst fears of anyone who dared to challenge his legacy. What kind of mind engineers a trap that assaults not only the body, but also the deepest corners of the soul? The lake itself was another masterstroke. The inferi were not summoned on a whim. They were planted like seeds beneath the water, enchanted to awaken only when the surface was disturbed. The stillness of the water was a lie, a calm that concealed death. Once Harry reached into the lake for water, they erupted in silence and pulled him under. It was not brute strength that made this terrifying. It was the timing, the elegance. The trap didn't shout. It waited. Another trap that revealed Voldemort's talent for cursed design was the locket Horcrux, hidden in the sea cave. When Creature, the house elf, was ordered to retrieve it, he was forced to witness the cruel death of his companion, Regulus Black. But even more chilling was what happened afterward. When Harry wore the locket around his neck, it didn't merely sit idle. It whispered, it infected, it amplified fears and bred suspicion. Ron's jealousy deepened, Harry's self-doubt grew, Hermione's rationality was tested. Voldemort had created not just a protective charm, but a psychological parasite. This ability to lace enchantments into layers combining protection with corruption was not a simple act of spellcasting. It required a mind fluent in magical logic, able to foresee the choices and missteps of intruders. Each layer of the trap was calibrated. The potion in the cave could only be removed by drinking it. The lake would only awaken if disturbed. The inferi would only act if they sensed motion. This was not reckless defense, it was strategic horror. In Bellatrix Lestrange's vault at Gringotts, where the Horcrux, in the form of Helga Hufflepuff's cup, was hidden, Voldemort's trap was a grotesque lesson in magical escalation. Everything the intruders touched multiplied into burning replicas. The cup itself was buried under a mountain of agonizing duplications. The enchantment was called Gemino, and it was paired with Flagrante, making the objects not only multiply, but burn to the touch. The more the intruder tried to reach the prize, the worse their suffering became. Voldemort understood human desperation, and he turned it against them. This strategy of attrition is a recurring pattern in his traps. Not immediate obliteration, but slow, grinding failure. The traps didn't scream, "Keep out." They lured, tormented, and punished. Psychological fatigue, as much as physical danger, was the true guardian. Voldemort's magic didn't merely react, it anticipated. Every safeguard he put in place was built on the assumption that someone would try to outwit him, and he made sure their own efforts would undo them. Even the final Horcrux, the diadem of Rowena Ravenclaw, was hidden not in plain sight, but in forgotten memory. It lay buried in the room of requirement, surrounded by mountains of discarded secrets, and when it was finally disturbed, it unleashed Fiendfire, a magical fire that not only destroyed everything it touched, but grew stronger the more it fed. This wasn't a simple fire spell. Fiendfire is notoriously difficult to control, and Voldemort didn't use it as a direct weapon. He embedded it as a final contingency. If someone should be reckless enough to touch the diadem, the entire room would become their tomb. What made these traps so terrifying was not just the danger, they were deeply personal. Voldemort didn't protect his Horcruxes with generic shields. He infused them with his nature, cruelty, paranoia, genius. The diary didn't just hold a memory, it manipulated Ginny Weasley into opening the Chamber of Secrets and nearly killing her. The ring cursed Dumbledore with a slow death. These weren't objects. They were living extensions of Voldemort's malice. One overlooked detail in the books comes from Dumbledore's own words. Lord Voldemort was highly gifted. He created protections around his Horcruxes that are complex and powerful. Dumbledore knew that confronting Voldemort's defenses meant facing something far beyond mere dark magic. It meant entering a labyrinth of intellect and obsession. Each trap wasn't just magic. It was a riddle with deadly consequences. Even the Nagini Horcrux was protected in her own way. Voldemort kept her close, often inside a magical sphere of protection that could move with her, as described in the Deathly Hallows during the final assault on Hogwarts. It was a living trap, one that struck without warning. He ensured that the last piece of his soul was guarded by something fast, deadly, and enchanted to survive. The movies often reduced these defenses to visual effects: dark smoke, green light, flickering shadows. But in the books, the reality is far more intricate. Voldemort didn't just place guards or set off alarms. He orchestrated psychological war zones. He knew his enemies would come, and he built puzzles so deadly they would destroy not just bodies, but hope. The films may have shown Dumbledore writhing in pain, but they did not convey the nature of the poison he drank, visions of guilt, of helplessness, of loss. That's not cinematic, it's literary horror. Magic in the world of Harry Potter is often whimsical, rule-bending, even humorous. But Voldemort's traps remind us that at its core, magic is a tool of immense complexity. To enchant a necklace is one thing. To turn it into a device that erodes friendships and poisons the mind is another. Voldemort operated on a level that most witches and wizards never dreamed of. His traps didn't merely protect, they punished. They taught lessons in futility. They made you feel small. There is an artistry in cruelty that Voldemort refined with each Horcrux. His ability to create magical mechanisms that react, evolve, and ensnare was less about defense and more about domination. Every encounter with a Horcrux was an encounter with him, not just a fragment of soul, but a full expression of his philosophy: power through fear, control through suffering. And yet the genius of these traps lay in how ordinary they seemed at first glance. A cave, a cup, a ring, a locket. Voldemort took the mundane and buried horror inside. His traps were not towering fortresses or glowing portals. They were quiet, still, waiting. Like the calm before a storm, like silence before a scream. And in that silence lived a kind of terror no spell could dispel. Only courage could. That's why Voldemort's forgotten skill, the construction of magical traps, is one of the greatest unsung elements of the entire saga. It's not that he was powerful, it's that he made every inch of his evil smart, planned, and inescapable. His traps weren't obstacles, they were mirrors showing the worst of the wizard facing them. And in that mirror, most saw fear, most saw doubt, but a few, just a few, saw a way through. Number 26, Parseltongue as a magical tool. Tom Riddle was not merely a Parselmouth. He was a master of the language of serpents, in a way that transcended casual talent. While Harry Potter inherited the ability accidentally, Voldemort molded it into a refined magical instrument, unlocking secrets lost to time. The films offered only a glimpse, whispers to a serpent in the zoo, commands to Nagini, but the books hinted at something older, darker, more arcane. In Chamber of Secrets, Harry hears the hissing that opens the entrance to the hidden chamber, but it is Riddle who first discovered how to use Parseltongue, not as a tool of communication, but as a cipher for ancient magic. There was a reason Salazar Slytherin himself had created his chamber with a Parseltongue lock. It was not simply to ensure only his heir could enter, but because the language carried magical weight of its own. The snake, symbol of rebirth, danger, and secrecy, had always played a central role in darker branches of magic. Riddle, in his relentless quest for power, studied every surviving text on the subject. In the shadows of the forbidden section of the Hogwarts library, In the banned grimoires he later acquired as Lord Voldemort, he found fragmented incantations written not in Latin, but in serpentine curves and sounds that writhed across the page. He spoke to these books as he would to Nagini, and they whispered back. What the world never knew, what even Dumbledore may have only suspected, was that Voldemort had discovered how to cast spells in Parseltongue. Not just to open doors or speak to reptiles, but to invoke magic that resisted the structure of modern wizarding spellwork. These were not charms or hexes taught at Hogwarts. They were primal, rooted in the magical traditions of the earliest wizards, spells that influenced emotion, bent animal will, unlocked hidden spaces, or twisted reality at the cost of the caster's humanity. Such incantations could not be duplicated in Latin, and certainly not with a wand alone. Voldemort often worked without one when using this language, relying instead on his voice and the strange resonance of Parseltongue's syllables. It was Parseltongue that allowed him to command the basilisk, a creature bred of death and shadow. But more than that, it was through Parseltongue that he discovered how to summon and sustain Nagini. Though she was a natural serpent, there was something else woven into her essence, something closer to a magical familiar, bound not just by companionship, but by spellcraft. The connection between Voldemort and Nagini ran deeper than any simple master-pet bond. In Deathly Hallows, it is stated that he seemed to be speaking to it as though it were a person, and this is not poetic license. He infused Nagini with will and near sentience using magic in a language only he truly understood. He once etched Parseltongue runes on the walls of the Albanian forest cave, where he hid after his first defeat. When later discovered by Death Eaters, they could not decipher the meaning, only that the walls pulsed faintly in response to sound. The incantations were not static words, but living phrases, changing with the speaker's intention and tone. Voldemort had created spells that sensed who spoke them. Like the door to the Chamber of Secrets, the magic only obeyed those who carried the heritage or discipline of the language. In the ancient world, this form of spellcraft was called spellbinding, and it was outlawed by multiple magical authorities for its corrupting effects. There is also the matter of Voldemort's untraceable movements. When the Order of the Phoenix tried to predict his actions or find his base of operations, they often ran into blank spots, as though the magic masking his lairs was immune to detection. Kingsley Shacklebolt once mentioned that certain enchantments don't behave as expected. These spells bore no Latin origin. Many of them, it is believed, were spoken into being in Parseltongue, crafting a kind of anti-charm barrier that confused scrying attempts. The language's organic, non-rigid nature made it impossible to unravel unless one could feel its intention, not just pronounce its sounds. Voldemort's study of Parseltongue also extended into symbology. In the Department of Mysteries, where ancient magical symbols covered the walls and floors, he recognized one particular spiral, not as a general protective rune, but as a coiled sigil from a Parseltongue-based tradition. These symbols didn't just ward, they responded to voice. By hissing the correct sequence, a practitioner could deactivate, awaken, or redirect magical flows embedded in stone. During the break-in to retrieve the prophecy, it's possible Voldemort used these skills to manipulate the building's internal protections without anyone noticing. While most witches and wizards focused on one technique and Latin phrasing, Voldemort explored how Parseltongue could shape magic from within. His voice became an extension of his will. Unlike the controlled wand movements taught at Hogwarts, Parseltongue magic was fluid, unrecordable, and personalized. That's why no one else could replicate it. In The Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore remarked that Voldemort had powers I will never have, and it was not only about his Horcruxes. Dumbledore, for all his wisdom, lacked access to the key Voldemort had unlocked, a magic that responded not to incantation, but to identity. The books never revealed what Voldemort did in the 15 years between his disappearance and his return. But if we piece together clues, the trail of disturbed tombs, vanishing serpents, ritual sites found abandoned, we see a man not just hiding but studying. He didn't just cling to life, he prepared for resurrection using forgotten systems. And when he returned changed. His voice, now snake-like and high-pitched, suggested not merely physical alteration, but a body shaped by the language he had so deeply internalized. It's no coincidence that his speech took on that sibilant, unnatural cadence. Parseltongue had begun to alter him. There's a passage in the Tales of Beedle the Bard that mentions a tongue that turns men into beasts and opens the earth like skin. Scholars believed this to be metaphorical, but Voldemort proved otherwise. He used Parseltongue to awaken forces that others deemed mythical. The cave where he hid the Horcrux, accessible only after blood sacrifice, responded to spoken command. It was not a question of magic words, Dumbledore mused, but of magic understood. The command to open the cave's entrance may well have been Parseltongue, unrecognized by Harry in that moment, because the magic was layered beneath comprehension. During the final battle, when Voldemort walked through Hogwarts, he spoke in Parseltongue only once, briefly, while passing a destroyed corridor. The stones rippled. A set of suits of armor previously motionless moved aside. McGonagall later insisted she had not enchanted them. That quiet hiss, recorded only in Harry's fragmented recollections, was a command in Parseltongue. Even in his final hours, Voldemort drew power from the language that had always marked him as different. Where others saw a curse, he saw an inheritance. Though Parseltongue died with him, since Harry lost the ability after the fragment of Voldemort's soul was removed, it remains the most mysterious of magical traditions. Not simply a means of speech, but a living relic of sorcery so old it predates even wandcraft. Voldemort didn't invent this idea, he rediscovered it, and in doing so he reshaped what magic could be. The Ministry never documented these practices, nor did any oral recover scrolls or journals on the subject. Perhaps they were destroyed, or perhaps, in true Parselmouth fashion, they remain hidden, awaiting another voice to speak them back into life. Tom Riddle entered Hogwarts already aware of what he could do. But it was the solitude, the lack of guidance that pushed him deeper into the forbidden corners of magical theory. In the quiet of the dungeons, among serpents etched into the stones, he taught himself how to think in Parseltongue. Not translate, not repeat, think. And once thought and language fused, his magic changed. He cast without lifting his wand. He healed Nagini with mere whispers. He opened walls that had been silent for centuries. And he left behind not a book, but a legacy of sound and shadow that no one truly understood. The story of Voldemort's Parseltongue mastery is not one of mere talent. It is a tale of obsession, of isolation, of peeling away the surface layers of magical education to find something ancient and raw beneath. In the eyes of most, his voice was eerie, but for him it was a blade, one that cut through the structures of magic and rewrote them in the language of snakes. And when he hissed, the world changed shape around him. Number 27, psychological control without magic. In the shadows of magical conflict, where wands clashed and spells soared, Voldemort's most terrifying weapon wasn't the killing curse or the ability to fly. It was the quiet, insidious mastery over the human psyche. This side of him, largely omitted from the films and only whispered about in the books, reveals a far more disturbing truth. Voldemort could dominate minds without lifting his wand. He was not just a dark sorcerer, he was a psychological tyrant who could bend people to his will through fear, charisma, and manipulation. He understood that true control wasn't always about enchantments, it was about entering the soul and rewriting its loyalties. Take Peter Pettigrew, for example. The man known as Wormtail did not come to serve Voldemort through a curse or hex. There is no mention in the books of an imperious curse being cast on him. He defected out of fear and admiration. In The Prisoner of Azkaban, Lupin says, Peter always liked big friends who'd look after him. It wasn't magic that pushed him to betray James and Lily Potter. It was the paralyzing dread of being on the losing side and the twisted attraction to power. Pettigrew's loyalty was not bought with spells, but with psychological chains that were far harder to break. Bellatrix Lestrange, perhaps Voldemort's most fanatical follower, offers an even clearer portrait of this dark charisma. Her devotion went far beyond obedience. It was worship. In The Half-Blood Prince, she snarls, "The Dark Lord has in the past entrusted me with his most precious..." Her voice trembles, not with fear, but with reverence. She wasn't enchanted, she was enthralled. Bellatrix's obsession grew not from magic, but from Voldemort's ability to make people feel chosen, vital, and irreplaceable in his grand vision. Her very identity became a vessel for his ideology. This psychological dominance extended even to the Hogwarts staff and students. When Voldemort returned to power, the fear that crept into the castle was not a result of direct threats or dark spells. It was the unspoken terror of being noticed, of being deemed disloyal. In the Deathly Hallows, the Carrows, a brother and sister team of Death Eaters, are placed in charge of Hogwarts discipline. But it wasn't their magic that silenced the students. It was the suffocating pressure to conform, the fear of being seen as different, the invisible surveillance that pushed even good-hearted people to keep their heads down. Even among his Death Eaters, Voldemort ruled not with love or loyalty, but with a calculated balance of dread and privilege. Lucius Malfoy, a man of wealth and status, once revelled in his proximity to power. Yet by the Half-Blood Prince, he is a broken figure. Dumbledore describes him as a shadow of his former self. Voldemort didn't need to curse Lucius to reduce him to this state. The psychological toll of knowing he had failed the Dark Lord, of watching his son pulled into danger, and of enduring Voldemort's open scorn was enough to dismantle his spirit. This wasn't magical coercion, it was psychological erosion. Perhaps the most chilling demonstration of Voldemort's power over the mind lies in the case of Severus Snape. Though ultimately a double agent loyal to Dumbledore, Snape spent years walking a tightrope between two realities, presenting himself as a loyal Death Eater. The complexity of his act required more than occlumency. It demanded that Snape immerse himself so fully in the world Voldemort created that he could exist within it without being discovered. To do that, he had to absorb Voldemort's thinking, anticipate his expectations, and speak his language. Snape wasn't just pretending, he was surviving in an environment engineered to crush independent thought,